Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Why don't you tell us who you are and where you are?
Oh, okay. Well, who I am is a complicated question, I guess. I'm a human being. My name is Martin Ucik, for those who don't know. And, I'm feeling I'm living my purpose, in my biological purpose, my learning, healing, growing purpose, and what I call my transcendental purpose in supporting singles and couples and co-creating healthy relationships. So this is just, I don't know, there's no longer, any bigger other identity than that. And I am, for some surprisingly, in Istanbul, Turkey, where I landed about 2.5 years ago to train integral relationship coaches. Was invited here actually by a coaching company that applies Ken's model. And since Ken doesn't travel, I guess I was the next bald guy in line that they wanted to invite. And I trained for 5 days here in a hotel, about 20 relationship coaches in the integral model. And I really loved it here and met interesting people. And they said, why don't you come back? And I had nowhere else to go. My house had burned down a year earlier in the wildfires in California, so I had no home really. And here I am still enjoying the affordable lifestyle in Istanbul.
Are there some protests and riots going on there around the rainbow flag issue?
Well, first of all, I don't watch the Turkish news, but I know people told me that last night or yesterday there were some riots about a new dean for a university being placed by the government, but I stay out of politics.
That's not your specialty.
That's not my specialty, no.
So we're going to talk about sex in integral relationships. First, what is an integral relationship above and beyond just being a relationship between two people who are integrally oriented?
Yeah, that's always the million-dollar question. And so I have a few answers. One of them is where couples make a commitment to each other to learn, to heal, to grow, and awaken, or the cleaning up, growing up, showing up, waking up thing that we're throwing around now very often. But they have an explicit understanding of what that really means. So they know that there are different levels of development in various dimensions of their being. I just saw that Integral Life also adopted what I used for a while, the dimensions of being, instead of saying 4 quadrants. So yay, uncomplicating the integral lingo a little bit. And so that's the foundation for me. So it's not necessary that people are at an integral level of consciousness development, because every person at every level of development can feel into these 4 dimensions. It's pretty obvious when we have people feel into them and recognize them. And then to say, well, there is one person who has these 4 dimensions. There is another person who has these 4 dimensions, and they have, different levels of development in them. And then only in an intimate, sexual, romantic, live together love relationship do these 4 dimensions really come in very close and intimate contact and often then rub on each other. And so that would be my simple explanation, or that's pretty much it. And then I take it to the next level in the trainings that I offer in books, is that actually this co-creation happens at each of the 7 chakras, and where the co-creation happens, so in the co-creative space, right, the 4 quadrants are always present. So if you look at survival, right, and that has 4 quadrants, sexuality has 4 quadrants, power has 4 quadrants, the heart expression has 4 quadrants. And so far up to the 7th chakra can Wilbur calls the 4 faces of God. And the focus shifts then from normal couples who are often like in love with each other, project needs on each other, have expectations, help each other, right? But there's always this each other thing. And in an integral relationship, as I envision it, what really is loved the most is what's uniquely co-created between the two partners. And there's either, I already kind of threw out these terms, they either it's already a big endeavor, live their biological purpose, which is to survive and to procreate and to form a group, form a family, and seek the best quality of life so that their children can grow and prosper and then get to the point where they can procreate and take care of the elderly. That's what is called the biological imperative. I call it biological purpose. And then some couples grow, and that's then more to me an integral relationship, have this healing, learning, growing, awakening as an additional purpose. So the biological purpose doesn't go away. So it's a transcend and include thing. And sometimes couples grow out of the biological purpose into this growth purpose. And some couples break up when one wants to continue pursuing the good life, or maybe with children or without children. And the other one, as happened in my second marriage, I became a sensitive New Age guy. So I got very interested in spiritual development and in other things, and my ex-wife was not. And then even fewer people awaken to this. What's often there are so many words for purpose that I made up my own word in a way, or used a different word. So I call it transcendental purpose because it goes beyond the other 2 purposes. And it's also, we now know genetically in its very root, we have certain talents genetically encoded that are, before we can make meaning of any of our life experiences. So it's transcendental in the sense that it's beyond experience in a kind of transcendent Kantian way, as little as I understand about his philosophy. But people usually call it soul's purpose or higher purpose or true purpose or authentic purpose or real purpose or evolutionary purpose or whatever people put in front of purpose. That also kind of includes all these. So I'm not discounting any of these, even though they always have certain different connotations or so, like sometimes metaphysical and sometimes other magical ideas behind them or religious ideas behind them. I mean, this book by Rick Warren, why I'm here or something, this purpose book sold like 40 million copies. So there's a lot of people who are interested in why am I here on earth and what am I supposed to do? And of course, the simple answer is to survive, to reproduce, to form a family, seek quality of life. That's why we're biologically here. But a lot of people don't even live that biological purpose in all its aspects. And so they're looking for other ways of making meaning out of their life. And I take that to that level that it's not just enough that we individually live our purpose, because evolution is co-created. It's a co-creative process. And it's also a procreative process, which is often discounted or ignored by many integral leaders, right? Evolution for them happens in the left quadrants and somehow in the right quadrants, but without procreation. That's one of my biggest pet peeves I have with the integral community, is they're often not procreating. So, and then they wonder why not more people grow into these higher stages of consciousness.
I relate to that very much. I feel like I frequently complain that higher philosophical and spiritual communities are far too oriented on books and on sharing their opinions with each other online. And it's never going to really be a community unless it does those foundational things that all communities do. And a big part of that is relationships and sex and breeding and all those sorts of things,
Yeah, raising children.
How important is it to focus on that stuff in order to ground these higher visions? Otherwise, they sort of stay in the ether to some degree.
Yeah. mean, some people are obviously excused, in from my opinion, if I may be so arrogant, because they devote their life to really, better the world and inspire people. But Ken said, from an integral perspective, we want to have that behavior duplicated in as many people as possible. And if as many people as possible no longer procreate, specifically if they're more evolved than the people who are in earlier stages, then of course we see, and I'm not big into politics, but I mean, for about 20 years, I kind of predict that the center of gravity is not moving more and more to higher levels of consciousness, but we're sort of going to be stuck or even see a regression. And we see that in the polls, right, where we just, the Democrats or postmodern people just shake their head about, a little less than half of the population.
Lower levels are outbreeding us.
Yeah, these earlier levels are outbreeding us. And there's a term that, unfortunately, it's only a German book by a theologian. The term is called preach and breed. So we see that all religions that survived, or all bigger movements, political movements, etc., that, not all of them, fortunately, but they all had this component of saying, well, if you're an adherent or a follower of my religion or my movement, we encourage you, or even mandate, that you have to procreate, because they intuitively, at least, were smart enough to know that if nobody procreates of our movement, then we're going to die out. And sure enough, this German theologian wrote a whole book about that, analyzing that. The obvious, then, when people become agnostic or atheist, or in other words, move into modern or postmodern stages, they procreate much less than people who are more in a mythic and by accident, probably often in a red or earlier stage of consciousness development. And of course, that would all be fine if we would have wonderful systems to give each child an equal opportunity, to get the best education that is adequate to their given talents and things like that. But there is another book called Dream Hoarders that came out 4 years ago or so that clearly shows, right, that if your parents went to Harvard, there's a good chance you will go to Harvard. And if your parents went to whatever, a school that was not very prestigious, or just, what I mean, not a private school or not a good school, then you will end up also in bad schools and hardly ever make it out.
So we would think then that, parents who reach more exalted visions or richer stages of consciousness create children who are more likely to reach those levels as well. And if there aren't children in your homes, or if you're not doing something else with kids, you're not passing that on. You're not setting up the momentum for them to get to that same place.
Yeah. You're not really passing on your genes and your memes. And, we now know, I just listened to a book on attachment theories, that 40 minutes after birth, babies already start to mimic their parents and create sort of like their attachment style, which has huge impacts on many other areas of psychological health. And, I don't want to sound judgmental, but it's just, often people are born into really adverse conditions where they don't get the early nurturing and that they need to even have the potentials, right, to grow in consciousness or reach higher levels of consciousness. And if it's true that the higher levels, solve the problems of the previous levels, even though we may argue about that too, then, this whole integral theory in my way is somewhat debunked, right? That there is an eros that just drives human evolution forward, even if the more evolved people no longer procreate. So I think that just doesn't hold up any longer.
Yeah, I think, you can imagine that there might be a tilt to the universe, but that doesn't really help us very much. Yeah. If Eros is at work, it's at work in our efforts.
Yeah.
But okay, so
and so the integral relationship, just to say that, my first book, I don't know if you know, it's called Integral Relationships, and I sometimes joke, right? It's like a manual for me.
Yeah.
And then other men wanted to read it, so I made it a manual for men, because
added an N for them.
I added the N for the other 5 guys who bought the book. The rest are piling up in my garage. Well, thankfully not. But really, I mean, I wrote this book really for me because I realized that I was not adequately educated or skilled or whatever you want to call it, evolved to meet the expectations of the Northern Californian women where I lived when I separated from my second wife, who I met in Germany 14 years earlier when I was like in the mythic orange stage. I was completely dumbfounded in this green / maybe postmodern world. And so very often, you know, as I see even in my trainings and everything, there's just like more women who either have the time or make the effort or whatever that is, who are interested in developing their, you know, do personal development and spiritual development, that there are men. And I see that as a real shame and a real problem, even though I acknowledge that men are often lovable and likable and are chosen if they're just focusing everything they have on their career. It's more likely that you get a woman that you desire if you have a great job and a great career and a high social status than if you're a 20-year meditator and highly developed but don't have a job. Right? So I mean that is like all. Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up and let you.
Here's a question, which is an integral relationship facilitator confronts some people, or maybe travels back in time and confronts you in the past, and they're interested in the sexual dimension of the relationship. What are the first things they ask? What do they look for?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Let's say you've got an integral relationship facilitator and somebody comes up to them and says, hey, I want to make my sex life better.
Yeah.
Information does the facilitator need? What elements do they start looking at to figure out what the situation is?
Yeah, exactly. So an integral facilitator would of course kind of look in the four dimensions. I mean, first of all, do you have are you in a committed relationship? You know, what is so like the relationship status? Are you single and not getting any, or do you have a few girlfriends? Are you polyamorous, whatever? And then, you know, I mean, I describe 5 stages of sexual development that are similar to the spiritual stages. So I developed for the insiders a Wilbur-Combs matrix for sexual development, because it's the same dynamic that people at very early levels of development can be highly sexually developed, and people at late stages of development can be very repressed.
Take us through those. Give us a little overview of what the stages of sexual relationship might be.
So the first stage is repressed sexuality. These are the people who don't want to touch it, don't want to talk about it, don't want to do it. And it's often because of trauma or hormonally very low libido, or there's many reasons, you know, can be the reason for that. Then the second stage, I call the fucking stage. It's where Ken Wilber said everything goes unless your partner doesn't call the police, end quote. But you know, these are people who are mainly out to get their own sexual needs met without consideration for their partner. And also, you know, there's often no, it may be consensual, but there is no conversation about what practices are okay, birth control, and what happens after the sex, right? Does somebody have the expectation to get married and the other person says, I'll never see you again? That's usually not really communicated on this level. And there is no real underlying committed relationship there. And with everything, you know, there's the pre-trans thing that David Data sometimes got into trouble with ravaging, right? That's like this very rough kind of like animalistic expression of sex. We can, of course, also take to like a transcendent level, but let's stay with the very self-absorbed level. And then the third level I call having sex, and that's sort of like what couples do, because that's what couples do, right? So they're usually in a committed relationship and they had some understanding of what sexuality means, and if this is for having children, or if they use contraception, and if they're monogamous or non-monogamous, or put a hand. So there's some conversation around the sexual context, but they're usually, you know, kind of like, are you in the mood tonight? No, I'm too busy or whatever, right? So they only have sex when both partners are in the mood, and it's sex at the lowest common denominator. So they're not really expanding on their sexuality. It's just sort of like going through the motions. And that usually gets old pretty quickly. So if somebody is at that level and they say, well, my sex life is kind of like down the tube and I'm very unhappy, then, the solution is, of course, like as always, on the next higher level, which I call making love, where so like the heart enters sexuality. And it is something where a couple say, okay, on Thursdays or on Tuesdays or whatever, when we, can make space. If they have children, maybe they go to bed earlier, they go to the grandparents or something, and they have a certain ritual around it. And they also look at emotional blocks, right? So if they were fighting, they're just not brushing it over with having sex, but they really look at intimacy in into me, you see kind of sense, and sexuality, gets that kind of, is based in a loving connection. And if the love connection is sort of like compromised, or they have fights, they first deal with that before they then have sex. And they also expand in a way of using maybe, bring in toys or go to a hotel, or they just know that they always have to create new experiences for the mind, right? So that it always stays interesting and exciting. And that happens through creating new situations. And then the fifth stage is where sexuality and spirituality in a way merge, where sexuality becomes part of a spiritual practice of awakening, which we now usually refer to as tantra or sacred sexuality. So, and also the environment and changes, right? For tantra, you have then massage oil, and you do lingam massage and yoni massage and eye gazing and meditate together. And the man sits in a lotus or half lotus, and the woman sits on him. And so there's all kinds of different positions, but it's not about sort of like these techniques in the lower right and upper right. It's really about being fully present with our partner and not drifting off in some, past or future realms or fantasies.
Those are state stages. So you're thinking of those as something that people can undergo at any level of development.
Yeah.
What about levels of development? Do you see something like that in sexuality? Is it like there's a line of sexuality that can go up in stages or not?
Well, they're like the Wilbur-Combs lattice. So first of all, they're state stages, right? So if people listen to this, I said, yeah, I kind of, maybe with the exception of the first level, right? If we're healthy, I kind of experienced all of these, but I don't really know how to activate, let's say, the making love stage consistently, or the tantric stage consistently. And that requires practice, like spiritual practice. To make state experiences into stages require practice. And then when we look at it as a separate developmental line, right? And we would look at the Wilbur-Combs lattice, where we have the 8 stages of consciousness development and the 5 state stages of sexual development. Then a magical person, they will interpret, let's say, their transcendental or their sacred sexuality experience as something like some angels came through them, or have some other magical explanation around that. And the egocentric person may feel like I'm a sex god, or I'm a sex goddess, or something like that. And a mythic person will thank God, right, for allowing him or her to have that experience. And a rational person may think, oh, what kind of hormones were released in that situation, what's happening in our brain, and what kind of techniques can be used to recreate this situation. And people on a green level, they probably feel like, I don't want to just limit this to one partner. I want to share this experience openly, right, with more partners, and see how this works in a group or in a community or in a polyamorous relationship. And so each state, and then the integral people, they would look at the 4 quadrants and find the good, the true, and the beautiful in that experience. And the transcendental people, they're probably not even thinking about it. For them, that's just normal, the normal way of being, right, without even creating a story around it. Does that make some sense?
That's great. Yep.
And so now, if I would now talk with someone who's not happy with their sex life, right, I have the vertical stages, see where is this person. I have the 5 state stages, where is this person. And then what is happening in each of the quadrants. Maybe they're physically unhealthy and they're on antidepressants, which lowers your sex drive, or they smoke too much pot, which makes you not so what is the word, erectile, potent, right? Or things like that. Or look in the lower right, right? Is there a safe environment to be sexual? And so on and so forth. And then, of course, also see what kind of partners are we talking about? Are they married? Or I already mentioned that. And so we have quite a few dimensions, 8 times 4, right? Times 4 quadrants for one person. And then we have that for 2 people, right? And so out of that, usually then a path. I mean, there's no point if they're too far apart in their development and somebody wants to have tantra and is unhappy that doesn't work and the other person is barely in the having sex stage, right? Then of course that doesn't work, like it doesn't work with any kind of relationships where people are at different levels.
Can you have a really good sex life if you're at different levels of values?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. But I know which I wear the future of love is integral t-shirt, but my other t-shirt says love is unconditional, relationships are not. So you can have a great sex life with people who are at a similar level of sexual development as you are, but you may not be able to live with them, right? If you're at different levels of consciousness
right.
development. And if you confuse a great sex life with also having a great relationship when it gets to money and to living together and raising children and everything, then of course you're in big trouble. And a lot of people get into trouble because of that. Because the only factor for their sexual selection is their primary fantasy and how great the sex is. And then they try to make everything else work. And, hopefully they're at a similar levels of development in other developmental lines, but often people are not. And that's, of course, the strength of the integral relationship model or the integral model in general, that we have a better idea who is compatible with us in the 4 quadrants and in the major developmental lines.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago some of the factors in the material dimension of being.
Yeah.
I think that's really important because I've talked to a lot of people on this series now, and very often I say, what about sleep? What about diet? What about exercise? What about blood flow to the extremities of the body so that the organs can actually work? And they say, of course, they go, yes, that's very important. And immediately they go back to psychological and spiritual discussion. Yeah, of course we address that. But they don't really put an equal focus on that dimension. So, how important is that dimension? It's certainly the one that the drug companies are focusing on, which should tell us that it's important. But what,
You mean more the lower right, the Viagra and things like that? Yeah. Okay. Well, name the baby by the name, right? Yeah.
Yeah. How often do you think people who are very spiritually and psychologically oriented tend to overlook the realities of the physiology in terms of having a good sex life?
Very often. So yeah. I mean, a classic example is that guys come in and say, I want to practice this Tantra stuff. And can you teach me? I say, okay, let's sit down and let's sit cross-legged for half an hour. Well, I can do that, right? So, I mean, this is like very simple. So how can you be in a classic tantric position if you cannot, and I know that's not easy. It takes some practice. So I say, before we practice Tantra, right, we're practice sitting. And I thought, well, I thought I can practice tonight with my girlfriend. I said, no, that's not the kind of Tantra we're talking here about, or eye gaze or breathe together, right? So, it's very important.
For me, it's something that comes up a lot. Like my sex life is vastly better if I make sure it happens before dinner rather than after dinner.
Or long after dinner.
Yeah, or long after dinner. There's so many of those factors in order to get the physiology to help you produce the internal states that you want to be in.
Yeah. So it's very hard to feel into other people's bodies. I mean, I don't know, maybe that sounds like bragging, but I haven't drunken alcohol in 20 years. I don't smoke. I run 15 kilometers once a week and walk every day. I'm a vegetarian. I take cold showers in the morning. I mean, it's not only for my sex life. I just do whatever I can to live in a healthy body. That's and I think that shows up in my sexual vitality and also my experiences around sexuality. I mean, it's the highs, that are there after orgasm, I think are much more intense now that I'm more awake and more physical fit than maybe 30 years ago. And so if you want to have great orgasms, your body has to be in shape. And if you want to satisfy your partner, you have to be able to, control your ejaculation and things like that. And that's just like, yeah. Again, that's these things that I almost never think about. And then when I teach Tantra or when I talk to people, I realize what you just said, that a lot of people just think if they're with a perfect person, they give them that great sexual experience. But that's usually not how it works. Maybe if you get lucky, have a state experience, but to have it as a stage, yeah. And that's the same with the lower right? You need an environment specifically for women. I found, if you have a real nice love-making room or bedroom or wherever you make love and it smells good and you have the candles and you have the music and the right light and it's just a nice atmosphere that allows women specifically to relax, right? It's totally different spiritual experience, sexual experience than if you do it on the back of your car seat, and unless you're in the moment full of love hormones anyway. And I mean, that can be exciting too, but you know what I mean? The lower right is important too.
Take that dimension into account one way or another.
Yeah. And of course, then your values around sexuality and your conditioning and the shame and the fears, and is all in the lower left. And then how present you can be with your partner and really notice any kind of like little subtle energy or body movement or just being fully there with her without being into thought about work or when will she do this or that, but you can just be fully present without any expectations in the upper left. That's pretty much it. It's kind of as simple as that and as complicated as that.
That's the advertisement for having sex with a meditator.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Purpose and sex. Interesting places where they converge. Some of it is transcendental purpose and aligning your sexuality with your higher values, but some of it is just bringing clarity of purpose and intention to your sexual life. Do you find that some people are anxious about that? Like they feel like the key to the sexuality they've enjoyed in the past was its spontaneity and its unconsciousness, and they're worried about bringing too much of the conscious mind into the practice.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I'm trying to think how this is for me, or was for me. Yeah, it's sometimes really hard for me to imagine how it is with other people, because when I'm sexual with a woman, I'm just like fully there with her, and that just happens. It doesn't require an effort, and that's completely independent of my relationship that I have with her otherwise. I don't know if that kind of answers your question. And of course, when I was in a relationship with someone who shared my purpose, first of all, it was very easy to be monogamous because there was so much effort on what we co-created that there was really no real thought, sort of like that in this I could be sort of like a third kind of creator in there, and just this inner, what Barbara Marx Hubbard called, she passed away unfortunately, suprasexuality, right? This similar or even same hormonal release when we're really in tune with someone and co-creating instead of procreating, not only sharing our genes, but also sharing our memes, as she says. I think that also then just this harmony and this synergy and this, you're co-creating all day in some way, and then you become sexual and the co-creation just continues in a way and is not removed from from co-creating with this person maybe in other realms. So I could imagine or could see that this is also helping your sex life. But I would not say, well, that's the only way you can have a great, sexual experience. You can go in a tantra workshop and be with a total stranger and do the practices of eye gazing and meditating and breathing and movement and feeling into your feminine, masculine energies and all the preliminaries, and slow down and be really connected. And you can have an amazing sexual experience with a person that you didn't know a day or two before, and have nothing else in common other than the spiritual development and the sexual development. Right? That person can be on a magic level and you can be on a transpersonal level. And she may have no purpose outside her, whatever purpose, and you are one who has a huge impact on making the world a better place.
You alluded to the feeling that goes on between people who are co-creating on a number of levels together, that there's an additional force or entity that shows up in that relationship, like the emotional, social, but also the sexual relationship itself becomes like an agency. Do you think that's just a metaphor, or do you think it really is like an entity starts to take a role?
Yeah. I had the musical director at the Center for Spiritual Living, where I played like 15 years ago. She often said we had musical sex or musical orgasms. I mean, everybody, I think, experienced that whenever we co-create something novel, we advance into novelty on our own, but specifically with other people. I think there are hormones, feel-good hormones released around that. That's why people are so excited about even these authentic relating groups, or any kind of group process. Or I mean, I've been a musician for many years. Just sometimes when it really clicks and you get into the zone, right, or even running with other people, or just this co-creating, I think is fundamental to our humanness. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been this rapid human evolution if we would not have this drive to create novelty and derive pleasure from it. And I think that deriving pleasure of creating novelty is heightened when we do it with other people, or if other people at least recognize what we do. I mean, I could sit here alone and talk into my camera, right, and never share it with anyone. That would be boring and maybe somewhat pathological, right? It's much more fun to talk to you and then to imagine that a bunch of people are watching this, and then it ripples and something bounces back to me. And this is what makes life worth living. Not sitting on a mountain playing your guitar by yourself. I mean, that can be fun too, right? But eventually we have this drive to co-create with other people. And sex is basically nothing else than co-creation, other than it has this little procreative aspect to it, and that it is really, can I say that, fucking intimate? Sure. No pun intended, right? So we have to become naked, and if we can also become emotionally naked, and if we can become spiritually naked, and if we can become naked in the sense of living our transcendental purpose without fear, then this all creates an integral relationship, including transcendental sex or
actual nakedness. Naked and all.
And there is a book by Jenny Wade called Transcendent Sex. If anybody's interested, she studied around that.
I saw a little video of you talking about love languages. And I have two questions. One is, how seriously should we take those? Are they just a fun game, or can it really help us learn something about ourselves? And on the other hand, is there an analogy to sex? Are there sexual languages?
Second question is new, so love it. So I take the love languages quite serious, but I notice that they shift a little bit depending on our life situation. Right. So, I mean, obviously, if you're impoverished, then maybe you appreciate gifts more than being touched. Right. So, but if we look at a longer trajectory, I can clearly say that my first love language is words, which probably doesn't surprise you, me ranting on here. And if I can have a deep conversation with someone about what I feel passionate about, that really turns me on. And if it's a woman, it turns me on sexually. I'm also in the Enneagram on the instincts and sexual or attraction type. So that also plays into that. And my second love language is touch. Now, in the last few sessions that I had with my training group, we also looked a little bit on shadow, because ultimately we felt all these 5 love languages are valid, right, and have their place, but and maybe we repress also some love languages. I have this kind of sad story in a way. When I was a little boy, I was often sick and had to go home from school, and my mom always made me sunny side up eggs, and she wanted to be a nurse, but she grew up during the war and couldn't. So I think she was even happy when I came home, so she could nurse me back to health. And it always took a few hours. And so for a few weeks at one point, I saved up all my allowance and bought her a nice box of chocolate. And she made me take it back to the store. Right? And so I thought, what does that do to a little boy? And then I noticed I really had this thing that I always had a fear of buying people gifts. And I also didn't want to have any gifts. So it blocked you on my 5th love language because I repressed something around that, right? Or wasn't encouraged around it? Or is that a natural thing? So sometimes I feel maybe that has a little bit to do so like that there are shadow sides to it as well.
That's a really interesting element, because there's a question. The types are maybe the least clarified part of the integral model. But when we look at types, we might say, oh, I should have balance among all the types. Yeah. Or I actually have a type and I should clarify that in myself and find people that works well with. Yeah. And so this idea that there might be shadow blocking the development of some of our subtypes, I find that really intriguing. It mediates between those 2 options.
Yeah. But having said that, and I've also sometimes I say, I'm 63 now. I'm too old to integrate my other love languages. So, and I seriously, if a woman is interested in me or me in her, I always send them an Enneagram test, a love languages test, and an attachment style test before I even move forward. And some people think I'm crazy, but I'm just too old to, and I know what I want. And I want someone who's also into words and touch. That doesn't mean we ignore the other ones, but that would be our default go-to love language.
I've talked to a lot of dog breeders, and they say most people don't even try to train their dog. And then you can train your dog really well. But they say more important than that is you have to get a breed that works with your lifestyle. Otherwise, no amount of training is going to fix that gap.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And so love languages and sex, good question. I mean, obviously, if you don't like touch, then your sexuality may have certain forms that I'm not familiar with. Since touch is my secondary love language. But words, I think, is very important. I had some lovers, they say during the act, talk to me, right? And other lovers said, shut up, right? Right. So that could be and some people may be opened, right, through if they get a gift, or at least if maybe some physical objects, can even be food or chocolate or certain feathers or whatever could be involved. And quality time is also probably a question of how long do you spend, right? Is having great sex 10 minutes and both are happy, or is it 2 hours and both are happy? So if you're a 10-minute person and the other person is a 2-hour person, relating it to quality time. And then the acts of service part, right? Are they enjoying receiving a massage, for example, or a bath, and you read poems to your partner? So does sexuality also become sort of like an act of service in some way? And if only one person likes to show their love through acts of service, they may just be the giver of the massage and never really want one, but in return, they would like to have a little bit conversation during sexuality to meet their need in the love language. So that's a great point, and I'm going to give you credit for I'm going to insert that into the sexual training module. I never thought about it that way, but it's a very good point.
The role of words is really interesting, and the idea of throat blockages and shadow and communication around sexuality, because there's some people who are, they seem to be very present and at peace with their sexuality and very able to play in the whole spectrum of energies, but they can't really have a conversation about it. They can't really speak sexually in a sexual act in a way that helps the sexual act. And also socially, a lot of the repression of sexual discourse has gone on over the centuries, and that may be that a lot of people have a blockage here.
Sex is not something you talk about, it's something you do, right? Why do men always want to talk about sex, right? And then I also think about orgasm, right? I mean, I only had sex in that way with women, so I don't know about men. But some women, I feel they want to scream, but they just don't. They I had a woman recently, she put a pillow over her head when she came, just so that that nobody could hear, right? And other people are very loud, right? So it's just fascinating how people are different.
We have kids that are here for a week and then gone for a week, alternates between two households. And so when they're here, we're a little more sensitive to making noise than when they're gone. What do you think about kids and sexuality and their exposure to it, what they hear, and when you tell them at what age? Like, how does the integral household pass on sexual data and insights to children appropriately in a healthy way?
I would completely be out of my league to have any. So I have 3 daughters, and we lived together until they were around 10 to 14 or something like that, or 15. And we're both Germans, my ex-wife and me. So in Germany, nudity around the house, even though my parents didn't show that, that nudity is something rather natural, or when I grew up, at least it was natural. So we walked around naked. So, and I took baths with my girls and things like that. So they knew how a penis looks, but we never really consciously thought about it. It was just like normal for us Germans. So when we went out naked into the backyard, somebody said, "Well, you can do that if somebody sees you." They called the police. I said, "What? This is my backyard." And I said, no, this is America. So I had to adjust a little bit to these roles, but to expose, I would be very careful to expose them to witnessing the sexual act and intimacy. We watched Captain Fantastic last night in our integral movie night, and there's a scene where the little girl says, what is rape? And the father has this, being really honest with his children, and so you could clearly see how she couldn't grasp the whole concept of that. But again, I'm not an expert in that field, and then I think it also depends on the relationship of mother and father. I want to be too. Maybe I say that when I knew that my oldest daughter would soon probably have her first period, I said, I would love to celebrate that with you and buy you a red rose or whatever sensitive new age guy I was at the time. And my daughter was like, "Shut up, Dad, that's none of your business," and da. So we actually never had a conversation about it yet. I'll put it on the daddy-daughter adult conversation list, So that was a little shocking to me that that I overstepped or was insensitive towards her. And I think that has to do just the relationship of the parents. So I think that's also, maybe I would point in the direction, what relationship do the parents model to the children? And that will probably very much inform when to tell what or how to deal with that.
I'm a little curious to get more information about your own personal journey with sexuality, and in its stage like form, right? So like, when did you When did you first become aware of sexuality in your life
Mm,
as a kid? But then also, what were the major turning points where you felt like
mm,
you entered a whole new space of how you saw sex?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have a real weird sex life in a way. So, so my grandparents had a restaurant, and so there was a lot of sort of like sexual kind of seduct, teasing, and of course that was in the early '60s. Women were still basically prey. So, and also in Germany, my grandmother read magazines that had totally nude women in there and talked about that, but that was normal in Germany. So as a young boy, I just also snuck these magazines from her bedroom and learned how to masturbate and kind of like and I don't know, I'm a musician. I started to play when I was 14 on stage, so I had so like a weird social life that I was always in stage watching other people hooking up and leaving, and by the time we were finished, everybody was gone, and I was not one of these musicians who knew how to pick up girls. So the first time I had intercourse with a woman was when I was 21, so late, and she was a nurse. And actually, I had a girlfriend before, but we never went that far. And she was a hairdresser. I'm not saying that's the stereotype, but they were both much more sexually evolved than I was. So I had really two women who were great teachers. And I married the first woman that I had intercourse with, and then we separated. The next woman who slept with me, I married, and I was together with her for 14 years. So by the time I was whatever in my 45 or so, when I separated from my second wife, I had just had intercourse with two women. So I thought, if a third woman sleeps with me, looking at my pattern, right, you know where this is going, I'm going to marry her and we live happily ever after. But I didn't know this at the time that I was in Northern California. Again, I was at that big center for spiritual living. I was the Power of Now guy. I played in the band. There were 70-80% of women. And it was not just being in a candy store, but it was almost like in a candy store where the owner shoves the candy for free into your mouth. I mean, maybe that's a little bit overdone, but I didn't have to do much, right? Women basically just said, hey, you want to come over tonight and have some tea and meditate a little bit. And you know where that went, right? And so for a few years, actually, everything went completely out of control sexually. And I got into the poly world and did tantra workshops and high workshops and all kinds of stuff. And then I was on a run once when I wrote my first book and listened to Andrew Cohen, who promoted celibacy and said you can channel all this energy that you put in your sexuality actually into your evolutionary purpose. And even though I had 5 or 6 lovers at a time, so like in some kind of poly loverships, I became celibate, I think, for almost a year out of choice. And then from there, I entered in basically in monogamous relationships or in single, into what is that called? Serial monogamy. So I was no longer so interested in Northern California. I know that's a weird perspective maybe, but there are sociologists who basically say, and I saw that in Northern California, that maybe let's just say in the New Age scene, right? Not in all the people, but in the green New Age scene, there were maybe about 20% of males who had 2 or 3 lovers who were monogamous with them, and it was really hard for guys who sort of like weren't alpha and didn't have the looks and the money and stuff, and whatever it takes, right, to find women, because the women were often latched onto one guy. At that time, polyamory was usually women be monogamous with a guy who had multiple women. And so I also realized that I hold some women back from being in a relationship. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So I became celibate, and then I was more monogamous. And my sexuality, I mean, it's almost went basically from having sex. And then my second marriage was not so sexual, and then to slowly evolving into the making love stage, and then into the tantric stage. And in Turkey, it's a little tricky to teach tantra. So you have to be very careful. But I teach sometimes tantra here, at least entry-level tantra, and also work with couples before COVID. And
the year of celibacy is interesting because
yeah,
do you think it changed you so that you had a
Yeah.
different relationship to sexuality afterwards.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I talked to Andrew Cohen the other day, so I'm curious, do you think he was right? Was that energy able to be converted and changed and used for this other purpose? Or did you ultimately decide it has to be used for its natural purpose?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew and I were also friends and we talk quite often. And I have Andrew on record on saying that he said, I think if I would have children, maybe what happened wouldn't have happened. And so I think celibacy, I mean, I was a sex addict, I admit it. And celibacy was necessary for me to get off that it wasn't destructive, but disruptive. And it caused some pain for some women and things like that. So, and I got my book finished sooner. That was also good. So yeah, I if somebody, is not in a committed relationship or maybe even in a committed relationship and wants to channel that energy for a while somewhere else, I think it's a good practice. I mean, I was celibate out of faith, so to speak. I didn't have anyone, or I didn't have, but if you have sex partners or a sex partner, just to decide for a while not to have sex if that's a lot on your mind, like it was on my mind, right? So like going in the other extreme, that was really great. On the other side with Andrew, and we see that now after the community fell apart and some of his students are actually now in relationships who I argued for years about the importance of the relationship. And they said, no, relationships are not important. And I think it's fundamental for any community, including spiritual communities, to show that your level of realization and enlightenment can be transformed into a love relationship. I mean, if it all collapses there, as Adyashanti said, then you have some work to do. I mean, that's where I'm the most frustrated, is like this. It's not hyper individualism, but this focus on my growth and my enlightenment and my development and things like that. And when I teach the integral relationship model development, I draw two ladders, that also expand to the top, and then there's one left and one right, and I say, it's not only that you're developing, and actually what level of development you have reached is actually meaningless if you cannot really be in intimate contact with another person and then see where you have the holes in your development, right? So I don't give much of a shit if somebody's integral, if they have a lot of problems in egocentric or have a lot of problems at any of the earlier levels that show up in projections and as shadow in love relationships. And it's integral spiritual bypassing if you want, right? If you say, I'm very highly developed and I can talk about the model forever, but I cannot even get along with one person in the world while I'm preaching world peace and some meta models that can solve all political problems or all problems that people are seeing. Start with one person and make it work on that level. And then take that, and take that to the next level and to the next level and to the next level.
That's beautiful, because we so often see people who, with some legitimacy, are describing their higher spiritual or intellectual or values orientation,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but they're always triggering everyone. They're always having a bad time in relationship, and they often are in their verbal relationship as well. They're speaking to other people at a level that's much lower than the level they're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm curious about.
And another pet peeve,
Yep.
if I just want to throw this in, I'm so like a hobby Habermas fan, and like his, and also see how much Wilbur actually drew from Habermas, and sometimes giving him credit. He has these validity claims, right, for rightness and truth and truthfulness. But if we look at these communicative models, or his model of communicative rationality, right, there's already the rationality, like most of the discourse that even today we're still having makes validity claims to the masculine, agency and autonomy and rights and justice, and very little to the feminine qualities of empathy and connection and I think I want to up-level communication that leads to action, right? To also bring in feminine qualities, but not swing over just to feminine, but really integrate feminine and masculine validity claims. And very often that requires, a male and a female, ideally. Anyway, I just wanted to throw this in as well.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we should probably touch on gender polarities a little bit more. But I'm curious about the validity claims for addiction. Like, absolutely, if you're over-identified with a bunch of mental activity, you might need to take that break or have some kind of discipline to provide a contrast so you can get a new perspective and a new level of competence relative to what's going on inside you. But where do you draw the line? Like, what makes you decide that you were a sex addict or that someone is addicted rather than just very interested? What's, how do we negotiate those?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in my book, literally speaking, it's important that we know what our purpose is, and which is either to procreate and raise healthy children, as I said, right, or to do the personal development. But the personal development, there's always the question: what is this in service of other than me, right? And so we need to get at one point to this next step: how does my realization make the world a better place? And so once we're clear about that, and we show some repetitive behavior around anything that gives us an altered state, right, or puts us that distracts us from one of these three purposes, and we cannot control that, right? So then I would say that's an addiction, and it's unhealthy.
Simply sabotages our own values and purposes. That's how we do it. Okay.
Of course, most people you ask, what is your life's purpose, or what do you feel most passionate about? They don't know, right? And so then that argument kind of like fails, and Eckhart Tolle simply says, it's just an inner impulse that doesn't serve you, that you cannot control. It's stronger than you. But it gets really tricky because sexuality is something beautiful. We can get addicted to it, but so often, of course, most addicts don't realize that they're addicted. And in hindsight, I think I was addicted. I was also addicted to meat. And sometimes people ask me why I became a vegetarian. And it was just the very simple reason, since I never drank much and never smoked. And by the time I was not a sex addict, the only thing I was really addicted to was meat. And I didn't want to be addicted to anything. And it took, as I mentioned, I grew up in a restaurant and butcher shop. So I was raised on meat. So so like an impulse that is against your values or your purpose that you cannot control, that has power of you. That's an addiction in my understanding.
One of my favorite things about Eckhart Tolle is his discussion of the pain body and of our attempt to recognize it and work with it through a kind of, whole body inner sensing, essentially. And I'm wondering about the role that plays in this. I talked to a woman the other day on this series who was an expert in female desire. And I asked her whether, does it make a big difference whether girls feel free to masturbate in terms of their later ability to integrate desire in their lives? And she, she's looked at a lot of data on the subject, and she says, no, that's a factor. But the major factor is, do they have inner sensing? So, how important is somatic self-awareness to be able to make progress in your sexual life?
There's a little part in the brain, I forgot what it's called, that really controls this connection between the body and the mind, and through meditation that also gets more sensitized, so we get more connected. It was an interesting question. So the pain body, and then Thomas Hübel, of course, has this collective, which Eckhart Tolle also talks about, the collective pain body. That, I think that's a good step in the right direction. Unfortunately, and as you know, or maybe you don't know, but I trained with Eckhart as a group facilitator and facilitated a Power of Now group weekly for 5 years. So I mean, I was a Eckhart Tolle groupie, but I'm sad to say he's also like a classical spiritual bypasser. I mean, he explicitly says in the power of now, psychological work is not necessary. All it takes is staying present with whatever emotions arise inside of you. And that falls a little short of an integral approach to shadow work.
You hear Eckhart laugh, it's hard not to wonder if he's holding something back.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, he is who he is, and I think he's probably one of the most enlightened people on the planet. And I think his work has also progressed. I'm not following it as much as I should, but now he talks more about purpose and making a difference in the world, and not every now and then I get the emails, and not so much just on this New Age narcissistic, hyper-individualistic awakening. So, I mean, everybody has their time, and he's still popular, but we moved on in a way, right? We have. I just think Robert Augustus Master's book, Spiritual Bypassing, is one of the, it's a really, really important book. Of course, there's many important books, but, and that's a term that was coined by John Welwood, just for those who don't know, much earlier, but Robert Augustus Masters wrote this great book, which I often recommend.
Popularized that concept, and that's, that's an impressive life's work on its own, just to have introduced that into the regular discourse.
Yeah.
Your mom wanted to
and of course the avoidance of relationship, or at least not, as Rumi said, your task is not to seek love, but to remove all the barriers that prevent it, right? So I mean, I'm single right now, and I'm happily single, but I also feel I'm available, right, without having a big search or neediness around right now. But some people are really on this like fuck relationships, or I'm no longer even making myself available. Right, so I have my profiles up on a bunch of websites. I don't even know, my team kind of handles that, but I feel I'm available, and that makes me sad when people close off on being in relationship.
That's a neat thing, because there are some legitimate and some fantastical problems that people have with Adida Samraj, but he introduced at least the language of relationship and contraction from it, or openness to it, as being at the center of the human spiritual enterprise. And that seems like a really important way to frame spirituality.
Yeah, I like that. I know very little about him, so I'm not.
Here's the thing I was going to ask, though. Your mom wanted to be a nurse. Your first sexual experience was with a nurse. What do you feel your relationship is to that archetype? And are you nursing people into integral relationship right now? Are you fulfilling your mother's impulse in your life?
Well, I was definitely very conditioned in this little village where my grandparents were. So my father met my mom there when there wasn't even a paved road to that village. It's a little bit like the Galleons or something, like 350 people. And he could only marry my mom under the premise that they would work there on the weekends in the restaurant, because my mom was an unpaid worker until she was 23 and married my dad. And so the weekends I always spent there. And what I saw there was my grandparents and then my uncle when he was married, and also the farmers. That men and women labor together, right? And it was sort of like, and that is sort of like what I want to recreate. That's my fantasy or my conditioning. While when I was in the city where my father worked as an electrician for the utility company, people barely talked to each other, and women were full-time mothers and men were at work, and I barely saw my father. And when I went to my grandparents were always together and working together, and everybody was working together. I think that had more of an impact on me than my mother's nursing instincts. I'm very clear that it had a deep impact on me. 5 days a week in this cold, technical, whatever, semi-industrial environment, which I struggled in. I have a learning disability, so I only went to school for 8 years. I never went to high school. I never went to university. And then on the weekend, I was in this warm, fuzzy environment where my grandparents were, with music and food and laughter and just working together, playing together. It was just like all play. Life was fantastic there. And I think I haven't let go of wanting to recreate that in the world, so to speak, or at least in my life.
That makes me curious about politics. I know that's not your specialty and you're not necessarily tracking Turkish news.
Yeah, no, I
But
don't.
there's been a lot of people like Wilhelm Reich who really thought about the relationship between sexuality and the types of economics and political societies we have.
Mm-hmm.
And, what do you think we need socially in order to help people have healthy sexual and relational lives? What kind of societies would facilitate that?
That's also a very good question. I mean, the more capitalist, I mean, I grew up in West Germany, and of course I know a little bit about East Germany, and it's interesting to do relationship workshops in Germany because the East Germans have a very different view on relationships than the West Germans. And even now in my training, I often have East Germans and West Germans. And so I think my general sense is the more capitalist a society is, the stronger the primary fantasy, right? That women want success objects and men want sex objects is pronounced. And the more men and women do or have to do in order to fulfill these primary fantasies in order to attract a partner, and the more that the focus shifts to that, right, the less the other qualities that are actually really important are looked at in the sexual selection process. And of course, ultimately, who chooses whom and why determines what kind of societies we're creating over time. So I was quite shocked when I moved to America, even though I had been there 20 times as a tourist. My wife was pregnant when we moved there, and I wanted to get health insurance. And the agent said, well, your wife is pregnant. That's a pre-existing condition. You cannot even get any insurance. And it was 95. I thought he was joking. I mean, I had never heard of a pre-existing condition not getting insurance. And of course, colleges being expensive and all of that, makes American women, this rogue capitalism, much more dependent on men being good providers. While in Germany, everybody has health insurance since 1897 or something like that. You cannot get out of the system even if you want to, unless you make a lot of money. And all the colleges are basically free. So raising a child in Germany is whatever costs $100,000. In America costs $500,000. And so I think that has a deep impact on love relationships. And so, socialism is basically good for relationships. Communism is not so good for relationships because then you have corruption and all these things. But a good social democracy, and the more social, the better, really lowers the pressure on people to, for women to have breast implants and to go to the extremes of whatever they do to their bodies, right? And also have all the body shame and all that stuff. And men having all the shame of not making enough money or not being tall enough, because tall equals success, right? In capitalist societies. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's something actually I'm really very interested in. And when I say I'm not interested in politics, I'm just saying I'm not interested in Turkish politics for good reasons. I'm very interested in American or German politics as an observer, not as a commentator or an expert.
It sounds like there's a definite direction in the way that you're thinking about it.
But what's also interesting, and maybe Americans never think about that, when America was colonized, it was waves of men who came first. And so women were always scarce. And then, the men moved to the West. And there are actually maps that show how many men and women there were when America was colonized. And so when people ask me what's the difference between German and American women, I say the biggest thing is that American women have this sense of entitlement that I think in no other country women have. And that comes from the colonization of America, that they were always scarce at the beginning, and that's still embedded in American culture. And then, of course, that's probably the most expensive country to raise children. Also has this fact that they feel entitled to a partner who is a good protector and provider. I mean, look at all the guns, right? So this protecting thing in Germany, what do you want to protect me from, right? In America, this is such a fear-based society, right, that someone who can protect you. The wife of Bill Gates in a Netflix series called Inside Bill's Mind says in that series that Bill was traveling a lot, and I was alone in this big house and I didn't feel safe. I mean, my jaw was dropping down at the time, the richest man in the world, probably full of security guards and shit. And the wife says, I don't feel safe when Bill is not at home. I mean, there you have it, right?
Yeah, it really builds in security as the basis of people's relationships. But, when you described early American, I hadn't thought about this before, the idea that there was a whole bunch of men there first.
Yeah.
That was also the situation in Rome. The famous paintings of the rape of the Sabine women. Rome was a collection of men who had to go and get women from other tribes.
Yeah.
And many people have commented on the similarity between the sort of Roman imperial psychology and the American imperial psychology. And I wonder to what degree that's an extension of just starting with a whole bunch of men on their own.
Yeah, yeah. And then, we see that sometimes in Westerns and things like that, right? It's all guy and then a few women, and they're the prize, right? The lucky guy who gets the one woman. And of course, then she can pretty much demand, at least at the beginning, right, anything. The flip side to that is that once she says yes, then very often they also become very controlled and dominated, because now the guy has to protect her from all the other guys who don't get any, right? But if there is an equal number of men and women, or in Europe, there were always more women than men, usually because more men died in wars and in work accidents and things like that. So once you had a woman, right, there were still a lot of other women for the other guys, so you didn't have to be so jealous and so protective of her and shoot the other guys who were looking at her or whatever. And so America is like really strange in that. And
well, speaking of war and Europe, I popped into my mind a mini series from a couple of years ago. It was called Deutschland 83. And it was about an East German young man who's sent undercover into West German military in the early 1980s. And there's it's a fantastic series because the Russians believe that the American West German military exercise is actually an attack, and they prepared a counterattack. And this was a real historical event. The Russians started to go to war, not realizing that the Americans and West Germans were just doing a training exercise. But it's a fascinating series to get a slice of what maybe West Germany was like at that time, because there's this mix of Cold War mentality and people who lived through the Second World War, but there's also the beginning of the Green political movement. There's also the Radichnishis. There's also, it must have been a very interesting place to grow up with this mixture of old-fashioned repressions and new explosions.
Yeah, yeah. Except I must admit, at this time, I was not very interested in any of that. I was just interested in playing music and building my music store. So, and I really regret that when the wall came down, of course, we were all glued to the TV and we couldn't believe it, that I didn't jump in my car, and drove there to be part of just that excitement. We were there a few months later, and actually I still had genuine pieces of the Berlin Wall, right, that I took, but they all.
There's something beautiful about not going. The wall's coming down. Yeah, but I'm making dinner. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was a historical moment, and that time was really interesting because I also distributed products, software that was made in East Germany before the wall came down. And so we talked a lot about the East Germans and anyway, but that's a bit beyond my topic of relationships. Even though it plays into that understanding, right, that the sexual selection process still in East Germany is noticeably different. What women are looking for there is less primary fantasy and more substance. I often have the impression than even in West Germany, and then it gets more extreme if you get to it.
We would think that perhaps where where the socialism is sophisticated enough to balance out the capitalism, those societies have a little bit less of those primary fantasies, which lead to unsatisfying sexual relationships. And we can see that by comparing some of the European countries with America. But I mean, what's your sense of Turkey? What is there? I mean, other than having to be a little bit careful about Tantra, what do you see as the sort of cultural attitudes or differences between Turkey and, say, Europe and America?
So the fascinating thing about Turkey is that of course, it's a very traditional country, or I mean, even that is not really true. I mean, first of all, it's very multicultural. There's basically no Turks per se. They're all coming from somewhere else in a way. Of course, they assimilated and they identified with Turkey. And then they had Ataturk, who wanted to modernize Turkey and so bring it to the West. So out of this, Constantinople, this 4,000 year history on the Bosporus, this modern, if I look out the window, it's dark now, right? But I in one direction, I'm more or less seeing, people areas where real poor people live, and I look in the other direction, and you would think I'm in New York, right? There are the high rises. And so it's this mix that America doesn't have, and maybe even Europe doesn't have, in that sense, that this country was modernized extremely fast. Right? I mean, hardly anybody here has a phone, a cord phone, right? Turkey has one of the highest saturations of cell phones on the planet. I have real fiber running into my apartment, not somewhere on the street. In the apartment, never had it in America. So a lot of stuff is very modern. And then on the other side, politically and culturally, Islam is fighting like tooth and nail. They just made the Hagia Sophia back into a traditional mosque, even though it was a museum, and some other Turk made it into a museum. So everywhere they're building mosques. And so you see this clear tension between modern and traditional, and also then egocentric, of course. So to begin with, and so people that come to me are relatively well educated. So when we do stages of development, I play this game a little bit and say, okay, magic, then you think what comes. And often they can figure out, right, what comes after mythic or comes modern. And then I say, what comes after modern? And they just look at me like, what do you mean after modern? They're like dumbfounded that there could be anything past modern, but they're, the people who come to me, they're looking for what's the next thing. And so very often they get into pre-trans fallacy stuff. So Osho is very big here, and Reiki is very big here. So a lot of the remnants of green have sort of like swept into Turkey with very little real pluralism or the whole, because they still haven't let go of, their issues around sexuality, and male-female relationships are still very, very confused that some women want to have the modern relationships, and they usually don't find men who are able to have modern relationships. And so our meetings here before COVID were very interesting in that way, that the women brought the guys basically and said, there is a guy from America who he can tell you what I try to tell you, but you don't get. And I have sort of like a way of talking to these men and working with these men that they don't feel shame because it's not coming from a woman. And I'm very self-deprecating. I say, don't worry, I struggle with the same shit that you're struggling with, but let's see if we can figure this out together, because heavy wife, heavy life, right? And so, and also homosexuality is completely under the wraps here.
Right.
And then you have this traditional Habermasche insight that some cultures who adopt modern technology, but the culture itself did not develop the technology, you have these kind of strange dichotomies in society, and they're much more torn.
Yeah.
Right? Today, less yesterday, I haven't looked it up, but they installed a new dean in a very prestigious university in Istanbul, who Erdogan put there, and the students rioted, right? Who is probably very conservative and Islamistic, or not Islamistic, but a Muslim. And
Is there, there's Tantric Hinduism and Tantric Buddhism. Is there Tantric Islam? Is there, some small underground pro-sexual full spectrum form of Islam, or no?
Sufism is obviously the mystic branch of Islam, the whirling dervishes and Rumi, but I think it's, in that sense, it's more heart-centered. So with there is something, even though people are frustrated here, where they're more in their hearts than in their heads often. And I don't know Turkish people per se. I know the people who come to my trainings and workshops, and obviously they're in search out of orange, or to deal with their orange mythic conflict sometimes. And the integral model, just the integral understanding, is so powerful to help them and to work with them. But it's I don't know. So my book is translated into Turkish, or at least a part of it, and it sold within a few months more in Turkey than it sold in Germany over 7 or 8 years. So people here are reading, and they're very hungry for information from the East and West. And if somebody can integrate both, that is helpful. But I also say a little story, something I think that may be helpful for a lot of integral people.
Sure.
When I started teaching here, I didn't see myself as a teacher then, but I adopted the role of teacher now finally, or accepted it. I kind of thought I'll explain the integral model to them. And people found it interesting, but they didn't come back. And so I realized I don't really know why these people come. And I handed out Post-it notes. If anybody has groups or does something, I recommend that. I said, what attracted you to come here? What do you want to learn? What are the problems you face? And what questions do you have? And I collected about 120 of these Post-it notes and realized that these people came not to learn a meta model. They came because they had very specific issues. And I saw that the integral model can address all these issues, but it led me to basically breaking it down and to say, okay, we have answers for, your particular issues. And so then people came who were just interested in feminine, masculine polarity, or in communication, or in sexuality, or in fear, shame, or purpose. A lot of people said, I don't know what my purpose is. And so this is how my whole approach to teaching the integral relationship model, we now broke it down into 26 modules that are, each of them is really helpful to improve your relationship. And so it's like a buffet, right? You just say, okay, here are 26 different meals or foods, and you just pick the ones that you like or that you need right now. So it was a huge transformation for me, also to make it accessible to people at a mythic and orange level, and not overwhelm them or think they have to understand the whole model first before they can apply it, or it becomes helpful to their relationship.
Yeah, that's
a sense of humility. I became very humble here. Also my arrogance, right? To think, why do they drive in the wrong direction? Hey, wrong direction. No, you cannot drive your motor scooter on the sidewalk. No, you have to respect me as a pedestrian. All that shit went out of the window. It's just like...
Yeah, living in other countries can be really...
Whatever works, right? Police is just standing there. It's like nobody gives a shit, right? And it works. It's total chaos, but it works somehow. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about, and we're probably coming near the end of this thing, but let's talk about the gender polarities, because I've spoken with a bunch of people. Very often the Tantra people are very confident that masculine, feminine are universal archetypal polarities that are really good to understand things in. And obviously, at certain chemical, biological levels, there's fundamental polarization between most bodies. But when I talk to people who are, California teachers of mindfulness and sex, they're very acutely aware that a whole bunch of people are coming to them who aren't identifying with those fundamental polarities. And they're starting to think that maybe two things is a really limiting way to think about this. So
Huh.
what's your take? How useful is it, and how limiting is it to really think deeply about those fundamental masculine, feminine polarities?
Absolutely useful. And I just say, you can either breathe in or breathe out. You can either be empty or full, right? And then when we start with that module, I just say, where do you see polarities, right? Top down, right? They're all polarities. And the world cannot exist, right? One cannot exist without the others, without the other. So there goes out the argument that somehow, you can breathe in and out simultaneously, or be simultaneously full or empty, or light or dark, or at the top or at the bottom. And in the workshop, instead of arguing around that, I give people hula hoops, for example, and I play music, and I say, one goes inside the hoop, close your eyes, and you completely surrender to the person who's outside the hoop guiding you through the room. Can you completely let go, right? And can you be outside and be very confident in leading this person? And then you switch, right? And it's a man and woman. And it becomes immediately clear, right, who can fully surrender and feel comfortable being led. Eyes closed, a room full of people, so you bump into each other, you don't know where you're going, right? And then I set up a table, and I set up pillows, like ascending, descending, and I say, stand on the table, right? And have everybody see you and be seen. And you're also seeing everything from up the room. What emotions come up for you? Then cuddle in the pillows, get in a fetal position, close your eyes, feel into your body. What feelings come up? Is that the same? Did you feel the same when you stood on the table and when you laid in the pillow? Of course not, right? And then I say, on the other end of the room, you all dance together, you hold hands and you move together and you get close, but you're in eye contact and you're having fun and you're connected and you're kind of surrendering, but sometimes you're also leading, but you need to fit in the flow. On the other side of the room, you walk around by yourself, you look down on the ground, you don't connect with people. What feelings do come up? And it's amazing, there's no more discussion that there is no feminine masculine polarities after these exercises, because it's totally clear.
Right.
They're feeling energies, right? I always end up on the table, but I say I'm always leading the training or the workshop, so I don't know where I would be if I would be a participant. And when I lay down, I always hear my dad, don't be lazy, right? You can sleep after your dad. Do something, you have to work. And then I'm afraid that people step on me, and I'm afraid that I lose control of the groups. I have really strong feelings. When I stand on the table, I feel I can breathe. I see the whole room. I'm in control, right? And I don't mind being seen, being a musician, being on stage for 25 years. You're not afraid of 1,000 people looking at you. Right? That's where I'm home. And then, of course, you could have a very long table and say, on this side of the table, you walk alone. On the other side of the table, you're with other people. So the case closed for me, right?
Okay, case closed.
Not in the head. You need to have people to have the experience.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many people, blah, 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 right? Then you throw them into an exercise and they fall apart, or they can't do it, or they go like, oh, this is really hard, right? Or the person says, I had real brilliant integral people in workshops where after a day, nobody wanted to do any exercises with them any longer, right? The women said, this guy is just talking. He's not engaging. He's not participating, right? And so
Is there
embodiment is important.
embodiment? Yeah, I appreciate that.
In a relational context.
It's very easy to take it too socially and conceptually.
Yeah.
Is there anything else important about sexuality and integral relationships that I haven't asked you about?
Well, you had great questions that I don't know. I think being respectful is very important, and not seeing sexuality as something that's not natural. If it's respectful, I don't know. And I think if you can go deep with one person at one point, right, in a monogamous relationship where sexuality becomes part of the overall co-creation of the relationship, that's probably for now the end game, right? Where in healing, learning, growing, and awakening, and that also the showing up, the making the world a better place. If that's done with a partner, that we also can have a deeply spiritual, sexual relationship with, that's where we're at. Maybe we speak again in 500 years and in another life, and there will be another emergence, but I don't see anything beyond that right now. And I think anybody who teaches something that is less in pursuit of that purpose, right, of this, the biological, the growth purpose and the transcendental purpose shared at the level of all 7 chakras, which, by the way, includes the second chakra of creation, right, and of sexuality, their teaching will eventually be flawed, and will have problems, in all humility or arrogance or whatever you want to see it. So
well, I certainly feel that
that's why
there is a problem if people.
Right, this is called sex, purpose, love, right? Because it's all about understanding the opposite sex, living your purpose, and getting to a new form of love that's not need-based, but becoming based and co-created based, and not just like asymmetrical give and take.
If your development, if your spirituality, if your ability to include the dimensions of your existence isn't showing up in relationships, then it's not really authentic, is sort of how I feel.
Yeah.
So I'm tremendously supportive of your work. It's thank you for taking the time to be with me today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
I had a great time with you, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks, brother.